Hi everybody and welcome to the last insight of the season. As a special summer treat today, Tony is going to make us a mojito.
Actually, I'm going to do a little twist on it. It's called a Bajito because instead of light rum, we're going to use dark. And instead of just mint, we're going to also add basil. So it's a little bit more of an earthy, some depth to it. So, as with every cocktail I make, I'm going to begin with a little bit of bitters. This is charred cedar and currant. Nice thing about the two tin shakers is we can build it in one and have the ice in the other because we're going to need to muddle the first tin. So just a couple dashes of that. And per drink, about a half ounce of simple syrup, 2 ounces per drink of rum.
What sort of rum is it?
This is something I just picked up today, rum Barbancourt. It's an 8-year. So it's a decent dark rum that doesn't have a lot of caramel or other rubbish added to it. And then per drink, 1 ounce lime juice. Now you could actually muddle in slices of lime, but we're gonna be a little more precise than that. And then about 10 leaves of basil and about 10 leaves of mint. And we're gonna muddle that not aggressively, just enough to how they call bruise the herbs. And we're going to pour that over the ice in the other tin. Shake that for 30 seconds. Press the tins where they come together to separate them. Then we're going to strain this over fresh ice in rocks or highball glasses. And this is basically a prototype. So I'm crossing my fingers that my spectacular instincts are intact. And then you have an option of adding or topping with soda water. You would like some?
I would.
Okay, I'm going to try mine without. And we're going to top with a little sprig of basil. There we go. There you are.
Thank you.
And also, happy belated birthday.
Oh, thank you very much.
Cheers.
That's very refreshing.
Yeah, actually, I think I prefer it without the soda. We shall see. Cheers. Well, here we are, end of the season. It's been a long season, but a very successful one.
Yeah.
And we have two really elegant, but also just masterful and glorious pieces. Elgar's Intro and Allegro, which is just for strings, and Schubert's Ninth Symphony, which is a gargantuan piece for its time. But let's start with the Elgar first on the program. Give us some historical context for the piece.
Well, in 1905, Elgar's publisher, whose name was Jaeger, wrote to him and suggested that he write a new piece for the strings of the London Symphony Orchestra, which had just been founded. Elgar had this very special relationship with August Jaeger, who was a German who'd come to live in England. He is the person that he wrote the Nimrod variation about in the Enigma Variations, his best friend.
Yeah.
And
which is the most popular or well-known of all the variations, probably.
So it's a nice pun. It's called Nimrod because in the Bible, let Nimrod, the mighty hunter, bind a leper to the altar and consecrate his spear to the Lord. So Jaeger means hunter in German, so it was a nice kind of pun on it.
Yeah.
So Jaeger would often critique Elgar's music and suggest what he might do next. So Elgar took the recommendation very seriously and immediately began to write a piece for strings. And in a letter, Jaeger wrote to him and said he suggested that Elgar would write a great bring the house down torrent of a thing such as Bach could write. And he even suggested that Elgar might incorporate a fugue in the piece, which he did, actually. So, introduction and Allegro. It starts with one of Elgar's most sincere and declamatory statements, this big, fat G minor sound in the whole strings. And I should say, the piece is written for a string orchestra with a quartet of soloists. So, two violins, viola, and cello, like a little string quartet sitting at the front of the string orchestra.
Is that out of the concerto grosso tradition, in a sense?
I think so. I think it's thinking about, ripieno and concertino in the same way. So there's a lot of play-off between the quartet and the string orchestra the whole way through. So we begin with this big tutti statement, and then the music, in a very typically Elgarian way, fragments into kind of constantly undulating tempo in this introduction, fleeting ideas, very nostalgic. And then the main Allegro theme begins, and it's a wistful kind of blow-away theme. Like it reminds me very much of the slow movement of the violin concerto, the kind of music that sounds like the wind in the trees. Alfie clearly doesn't think very much.
He hates Elgar.
You've heard it too many times this week, haven't you? Yeah. So the Allegro begins, and it basically follows a sonata form principle, except that where there would be a development section, Elgar writes a fugue, and he referred to it as the devil of a fugue, mysterioso, furioso, and absolutely brilliant. And that's one thing about this piece. It's absolutely brilliantly written for strings. Elgar, of course, always writes very well for strings, mainly because he was a great violinist who had played a lot of music as a violinist before he was established as a composer. But interestingly enough, many years later, the English composer Herbert Howells, who I'm sure none of you have ever heard of unless you're Episcopalians, a fabulous composer of some of my favorite church music actually, but he asked Elgar how he had learned to write for strings so well, and Elgar said, "Go to old Handel. I went to him for help ages ago." And I think that's a great thing to hear, because there is something, as you alluded to a moment ago, slightly baroque about this piece, relating back to the tradition of concerto grosso and of music simply for strings. And it's funny because there's so much great music written for string orchestra in the 20th century, particularly by English composers, that we forget that there wasn't really all that much before the 20th century. So Elgar was terribly proud of this piece, and he wrote to friends that nobody had ever achieved anything like this before for strings, which is perhaps a little bit of an exaggeration, but it really was something quite new and unusual to write a piece simply for a string orchestra. It has a severity, though, which is unusual for Elgar's music, and that meant that it didn't really establish itself in the repertoire until the 30s or 40s. There was a long period of time when it wasn't played much, and when friends would ask how the piece was doing after its first performance, particularly to Elgar's wife, it was always met with stony silence, because both of them were quite disappointed that the piece hadn't established itself more quickly in the repertoire.
And when was this written again?
1905.
Oh wow. So it's really an interesting example of how a lot of Elgar's music was either spectacularly received or took time to gain a little bit of traction.
Yeah, but this is the sweet spot of his life. 1899 to 1920, he's just pumping out masterpiece after masterpiece.
Right. But this is while his music is still quite in favor within the UK.
Very much, and even more so on the continent and in America. When he'd finished writing the introduction and Allegro, he spent most of the summer going around Germany hearing performances of his oratorios, The Apostles, and other pieces that were being performed. So yeah, it was a good time in his life, a time that he looked back at with great nostalgia when we get after the First World War, when his music fell out of favor so dramatically.
So after this, we move to the backbone of the concert, Schubert's Ninth Symphony, which, other than Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, is almost unprecedented in size and scale and how forward-looking it is. And the interesting thing about Schubert is he was one of the earliest of these bridge composers who you would say certainly have some. He likes Schubert, so he's back now. But there were many classical sensibilities about a lot of Schubert's writing, especially symphonic. I mean, this is the composer who practically invented the Lied, or German art song. And so there's both a classical and romantic sensibility that you can find in his writing. this piece is full of that as well, and it's it starts slow, which is not unusual. Haydn did that, Mozart did that, but it doesn't reach a point of a final cadence where you hit the Allegro. It's like all of a sudden you're at the Piumoso.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you approach this piece that is so full of new architecture for its historical period?
Well, I think that the unfinished symphony, the one that comes before this, and this symphony, the Great, are the two opposite sides of Schubert's personality. So the unfinished symphony is this incredibly sensitive, introspective human being, whereas this piece is the gregarious Schubert, who was, had a big group of friends and loved parties and was great fun to be around. I think that he's certainly thinking about Beethoven over his shoulder in terms of scale, but he's thinking very symphonically. The ideas of the piece are extremely outward and quite straightforward. The theme of the first movement, dum ba bum ba bum ba bum ba bum. Mozart could have written it. Mm-hmm. Everything is very public and sort of granite-like.
Yeah.
Where we feel Schubert's identity is in the harmony and the relationships of the keys. So the second subject is in E minor, which is bizarre for a symphony in C major.
Right.
The development is full of the most wonderful, terrifying dramatic music. The trombone writing is something that we would never hear in a classical symphony. Mm-hmm. And we're reminded that Schubert had written many masses by this time, 5 really big ones. So he was used to writing for the trombones. Remember, the trombones weren't really part of the orchestra until Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. So there's a kind of epic sense of scale, but with this wonderful sensitivity to harmonic color that sends shivers down your spine.
It's very forward-looking to some later German.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I constantly think of Bruckner in the way that the music is built in blocks that are deliberately opposed harmonically. So we have a first movement that has this miraculous introduction, a very unusual 7-bar phrase that begins in the French horns, that immediately takes us into the world of the German forest and all the associations that has, or the Austrian forest, I should say. Fairies and wild things.
Which in and of itself is kind of romantic.
Magic,
I mean, it's almost programmatic without being literally programmatic.
Yeah, I mean, it's the world of Midsummer Night's Dream of Mendelssohn, that fleeting romanticism. Mm-hmm. So a wonderful introduction, a powerful first movement with a very, very emotionally gut-wrenching development section. Brilliant stroke in the recap when he brings all the music back piano. The whole thing is soft for ages, which is wonderful. Then a second movement that is the absolute epitome of Viennese sensibility. Smiling through tears, putting on a straight face in the middle of great adversity. This spiky tune that begins in the oboe, full of dignity but with great pathos.
Yeah.
Then a scherzo, which I almost feel like he invented the waltz with this scherzo. So we think about the kind of trajectory of third movements. Third movement symphonies, a classical symphony, is always a kind of dance. Mozart or Haydn's time, it's a minuet, minuets in 3, it's heavy. Then Beethoven begins to write scherzos, speeds everything up into 1. But Beethoven doesn't ever write a waltz. It's always a fast minuet, or something in between. Here, though, in this slow movement, because of Schubert's Viennese sensibility, we can smell the coffee of the coffee houses, we can taste the chocolate, the elegance of the writing, the swirlingness of dancing with somebody with all the background blurring as you twirl around. Great elegance and beauty. And then a finale which is infamous for many reasons. It's very fast and it's very long, and at the first rehearsal, the London Philharmonic Orchestra, or the Philharmonic Society, to their great shame nowadays, laughed. The violins began to laugh because they have to play this triplet rhythm for so many bars that they just couldn't take it seriously. Melissa, the concertmaster, was telling me that the first violin part of the exposition alone of the finale is 12 pages long. So it's a lot of notes. So many notes that the Vienna Philharmonic still has a clause in their contract that they only have to play this piece once a season because it's so physically exhausting. And what's difficult about it is that even though it is physically exhausting, it has to be light and joyous and full of grace and sparkle the whole way through.
Yeah.
I find it very impressive, in the finale that Schubert is able to complete the piece with such a sense of form. He's written this enormous piece, it's almost an hour long. We've been sitting there for 45 minutes by the time the finale begins, and often composers have a hard time finding a way of finishing a piece that's posed big questions in the previous movements.
Okay.
It's a problem that plagued Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven and Schumann later, and all the way through to Mahler. It's always this problem of how do you sum up the whole thing.
Right.
And Schubert does it just by sheer force of energy and joy. And the finale zips along in the most thrilling way, and leads us to a very classical ending in terms of proportion and form. But we sense that we've been on a magnificent journey by then.
Well, perfect thing to end our season with then. So this is going to be a spectacular concert. I'm very much looking forward to it. Please join us Friday or Saturday night in Jacoby Symphony Hall, celebrating the end of this season, looking ahead to the next, and stay tuned. We'll be announcing next season very soon as well. A lot of exciting things to
Lots of great
hear
things
about in that. So congrats on a great season, Maestro.
Thank you, you too.
All right.
Cheers.
Cheers.